So welcome back. So today I'm going to talk about hope. So when I was in the military or deployed on combat operations, I used to laugh saying that when we went into a gunfight or we went into combat, going in with no plan other than just hoping for a good outcome was probably not really a great plan. So I used to laugh about it a little bit, but the reality is that hope is actually an important factor. And not only is hope important, but not being in a feeling of hopelessness is probably more important. So there's been some popular science going around, and you may have come across it, which talks about the rat hope experiment, in which a researcher in the 1950s got a number of rats and put them into glass cylinders filled with water, or 2/3 filled with water, so that once they put the rat in, there was no escape for the rat, and the rat would swim around, and they timed how long it took before the rats finally stopped swimming around and kind of sank to the point where they were going to drown, or they gave up swimming and sort of started to sink. So what they looked at, or what's reported in the popular science or through the self-help gurus and these sort of things, is that on average the rats swam for about 10 to 15 minutes, or about 15 minutes on average. And then when they pulled the rats out around about that time, gave them a bit of a dry off, a bit of a cuddle, gave them a little bit of love, put them back in there, the rats would then swim for 60 hours. So they sort of came to the conclusion from what they thought was going on in that experiment to conclude that the rats were given hope that their situation was not so dire, or that they would have a positive outcome in the end, or they might be rescued again at some point. So that hope allowed them to swim for 60 hours before they then gave up. The reality was, in the research, that's not how they actually did it. So in the research, they did get rats, they did put them in cylinders, and they did time them. What they did was they changed the temperature of the water, and they measured how long the rats swam for at certain temperatures of water. So at around about sort of 17 to 20 degrees, the rats swam for about 5 to 10 minutes, or 10 to 15 minutes. And then as the water temperature increased, so did the time that the rats swam. And this time increased significantly with the temperature increase in the water. So when they got to about 35 degrees, the rats swam for about 60 to 80 hours. So what it did show is that the duration that the rats would swim in the water before giving up had a direct or a very strong association with the water temperature. So potentially the rats just really like a warm bath. But what they also found was that the variation in the time that the rat swam for was too large to make any real conclusions with it. And they went to look on at what's called sudden death syndrome. So then they looked at wild rats, and they did a number of experiments with wild rats around trimming their whiskers, around pulling them out of cages, or putting them in situations where there was no perceived positive outcome. And the rats would die almost instantly, in some cases within 30 seconds. When they put them in the water, they'd die within, or they would give up within about 2 minutes. So they went and gave the rats a potential positive outcome. So if they were in a cage that they couldn't get out of, they would put light at one end so the rats felt like that there was an escape route at that end. If they put them in the water, they'd take them out and they would dry them off briefly and put them back in. And they would do this consistently over time. And what they did show was that the rats in the water experiment swam for the same amount of time as the normal rats, or the sort of domesticated rats. So they showed that it was more around hopelessness. So when we're in a situation where we feel hopelessness, or we feel that there's no positive outcome for us, we literally give up. So the experiment itself, and the authors went on to conclude that when we are in a position of hopelessness, then they're more likely, or there's a risk of this sudden death. So when we look at it, yes, hope's important, but feeling hopeless is probably more important, or those feelings of hopeless have a bigger impact on us. And this can be seen across the animal world, where certain animals will get to a certain age and they just wander off and die. They kind of give up in life. We've sort of seen it within humans and animals when they lose a life partner. Some of them kind of just give up on life. People that have had terminal illnesses kind of will give up. And there's all these sort of theories, because it's very hard to actually prove these things in life, but they've shown that when people give up, or they get these negative feelings of hopelessness, we kind of give up and we no longer fight, and we just kind of lay around and wait for ourselves to die. And we can also kind of get learned helplessness throughout our life, and that has another negative impact on us, but I'll talk about that specifically in another presentation. But what we want to go on to with is the hope. So I always thought when I was in combat operations, if our situation was completely dire, or someone else was in a really horrible situation, I would try and go and give them hope. So I'd reinforce them, give them the hope that there was a positive way out of this, regardless of the cost. I was always willing to make that choice. And even in my adventure racing, I always get to a point where I still will look for the opportunities with the environment to show me that there's a way out. And I've been into some environments where, or some situations where I wasn't too sure that things were going to end really positively, but I always looked for the information that I could use, or the opportunity that I could use to get the outcome that I want. And the beauty about hope and hopelessness is that these are thoughts, they're feelings, they're things that we can potentially, or we can influence through the way that we think. So if we start to feel that we're in a position which is hopeless, if we believe or if we continue that hopeless feeling, that will filter or change the way we filter the environment or the information within that environment, and we won't see that there's any escape or there's any chance to get out of this situation, okay? And we'll go into that hopeless cycle. If we can become aware of this, change it to hope, or start to think about there is a way out, let's look for it, and start to sort of move more towards the feelings of hope, then we can look for the information that's going to tell us how to get out of this situation, or that this will come to an end, and at the end of this, then we're going to have better skills, we're going to have learnt more, we're going to have more tools and strategies to move forward into the next situation or another situation that may be just as kind of difficult or challenging. So we need to understand that, yes, hopelessness can be a really negative thing, but we have control of that. We can choose to move out of hopelessness once we find ourselves going into it. And that's just a sort of state of awareness or self-awareness of how we're feeling in our emotional state. So we can sort of influence, or we can understand that, influence our thoughts and what we're thinking back to sort of moving towards hope, or just positive, or a belief that we can get out of this, and then start moving in a better direction. And this is kind of where things like religion and those sort of things come in, because those people have given up to a higher power. So there's always hope that that higher power may interdict and pull them out of the situation. So for them, there's always a hope. There's always another way. And it's been shown that religion has some really strong benefits or associations to people under trauma, or people that are sort of trying to realign their life. So I'm not really going to talk about religion, but it just kind of shows the power that hope has. So when we can understand that, we can leverage it. So I hope that kind of helps you understand a little bit around the difference between kind of what you'll see in self-help and gurus and popular science, because the way that they interpret science is not always actually correct. Okay, it can actually be beneficial, so I'm not going to say it's all negative, but understanding hopelessness and hope and how you can sort of change the way you think, the way that you feel, can influence what you see within your environment, your motivation, and how you go to get the outcomes that you want. So I hope that kind of helps you understand another little topic around hope and hopelessness, and I look forward to the next one.